to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Happy Love Data Week and welcome. We're so glad to have you here today, woo, for the first installment of our inaugural Love Data Week speaker series. Our theme this year is Spotlight on Open, and we're spotlighting 4 experts who work with open data in various different ways with coffee chats Monday through Thursday at this time, 1 p.m. Eastern. And then we're having a moderated panel discussion on Friday at noon Eastern. I will put the links to both of those things in the chat box once I hand it over to our speaker, so you can register for the others if you haven't already done that. Before we begin, let me just go over a couple housekeeping items quickly. The session is being recorded. Captioning is available. You'll be sent links to the recording once it's been processed and uploaded. That can sometimes take a week or two, so be patient, you will receive it. Please do keep your microphones muted throughout. You may choose to turn on your camera if you prefer, but do remember the session is being recorded and you may show up on the internet. We do encourage you to ask questions or raise discussion points in the chat at any time throughout the presentation or at the end. I'm going to be posing your questions to our speaker after he finishes his slides. This webinar series is hosted by the Research Data Management Working Group of the Network of the National Library of Medicine. We're an outreach and engagement arm of the National Library of Medicine, and we provide free training, funding opportunities, and lots more nationwide. You can learn more about us at nnlm.gov. As a companion to our series, we've compiled a list of 23 things about open data. These are fun tips, resources, and more that can help you learn more about open data and its uses. You can download the PDF of this list from the course pages for either the coffee talks or the panel discussion. And the slides for each presentation will also be available for download from those pages. So now, without further ado, allow me to introduce today's guest, Ibrahim Ali, PhD. Ibrahim is the sciences data librarian, at UCLA. So Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking the organizers for putting together this event series and giving me the opportunity to speak. It's really a privilege to be here, and I'm excited to get things started. I don't know, for me, I'm kicking off Open Data Week because it's still morning on the West Coast, but for everyone else, maybe your week has already started. So today I'm going to be kind of giving an overview of my perspective coming into an institution like UCLA on how we provide data literacy training. So it's going to be looking a little bit less on applications of open data, but really how we train people to work with data and think about it in an inclusive and accessible way for complex institutions. So before we kind of get into the details of the talk, I want to very briefly introduce myself. As Kelsey mentioned, my name is Ibrahim Ali. I'm the sciences data librarian at UCLA. I've been working there for about 2 years now, coming up on 2 years, really looking at this question of how do we make data literacy training as inclusive and accessible as possible. Prior to that, I did my PhD at UCSF, looking at virology and immunology, studying that primarily, and then I transitioned to a postdoc studying epigenetics and chromatin. So I did quite a bit of bioinformatics. I've been kind of deep in the research kind of workflow and pipeline, the education side of things for the greater part of the last 10 years or so. So with that perspective, we're kind of seeing me as a researcher navigating a library and an institution set of resources to figure out how do we learn how to do the technical skills that I really wanted to learn as a graduate student, but didn't have the opportunity to do so because of just a variety of steps. And we'll see some examples of that. Just kind of reiterating the session overview, I'm gonna give everyone a picture of what data literacy training looks like at UCLA. We're gonna dive into one particular example of a group that provides data literacy training services in bioinformatics in particular. We're going to then talk about how this group creates open educational resources through the use of open data. And I'm sure we're going to have plenty of talks about that over the course of the week. And then finally, I'm going to end with some reflections on how we're thinking about making data and digital literacy as accessible and inclusive as possible. So with that, we're going to start by painting this picture. How did we get here? As you can imagine, at any academic or research setting, there are a very wide range of digital literacy skill sets. And at UCLA in particular, and I'm thinking just this as an example for people to kind of draw parallels towards, at UCLA, the range of skill sets is very wide. We have new undergraduates coming in from underrepresented backgrounds that have never been exposed to the level of advanced technology found at our institution. And we also have faculty members decades into their research who have deep academic expertise, sometimes with limited technological know-how. And we also have everything in between. So somehow through the efforts of our institution, we have to bring the ingenuity of diverse and brilliant minds into this kind of deep pools of research and academic rigidity that exists through the infrastructure that we currently have. All right, so I'm showing you this kind of blob graphic of all of the services providers at UCLA. Just to kind of give a little bit of context, at this institution, support and training for computational skills has been administered through departments, partially because technology has advanced so quickly that like an institution as kind of big and bulky as UCLA hasn't been able to create this kind of streamlined infrastructure for teaching these interdisciplinary data and analytics tools to all of these different departments. So what has happened is there's usually a technically advanced class that's paired with conceptually advanced content. So when you have situations like that, this leads to unequal and inequitable distribution of skills favoring those who have prior experience or deep technical knowledge in a particular field. And in this case at UCLA, it's probably like this at a lot of institutions, departments in engineering, math, computation, biotechnology, informatics, physics, medicine, they have these resources. So they're training their populations and their scholars, but a lot of other scholars in other areas like social sciences, political sciences, humanities, they're not trained in some of these skills. And so there's kind of this rift in who gets access to education. So even though in this case, siloization of computational training has been effective for some, navigating this set of resources is really, really complicated and people get really easily overwhelmed. And so it's not a very sustainable and equitable model. And just to kind of point out what we're looking at here is each of these dots represents a group, literally a group of service providers that have different scales of influence over the kind of data literacy training that happens at our institution. So it's a lot, and navigating that as a researcher and as a student is really, really overwhelming. So while I was kind of doing this kind of mapping of my own, I came across some people at UCLA who were doing a similar mapping project. And in this case, I worked with Yoko Kawano, Anthony Caldwell, and Deidre Whitmore across various kind of, so they're each from their own little blips in that map that I showed earlier. And their idea was to create this one-stop shop, like an interactive map that can be easily navigated in a web browser to find resources for particular steps in the research lifecycle. So what I'm showing on the slide here is essentially a map. It's like a you can think of it as like a public transit map of the research process. And at each stage, there's something where there is a service provided. And each of these boxes that shows up here is either a person or a small group that can help people with their research. Unfortunately, because there are so many different stakeholders you can imagine on a map like this, and there's just all these different moving parts and a lot of different opinions in terms of how something like this should be implemented, we ended up focusing our efforts in informing faculty of these resources informally. So because we focus on our faculty, and one of the issues is a lot of the time students and postdocs and kind of not necessarily the faculty are doing a lot of the like hands-on work with some of this content. And so because of that, it's still like we can map out the resources, but still the critical populations are kind of really like diverse pool of skilled individuals. This information still isn't reaching them, which kind of poses another challenge. How do we ensure students are the ones who are getting the appropriate training? Because faculty, there are a lot of these outreach efforts that already exist for them. we want to make sure that students are the ones who get access to these resources. So kind of with that, I want to keep this kind of lineage of thought where we're thinking about how do we make sure that these services reach the people who are actually doing the hands-on research within the variety of research groups that exist within a particular institution. So what we're going to do is transition into looking at a particular example that we have at UCLA and one partnership that we've created with the library on how to kind of deliver some of these services to our population. And I picked this group, the UCLA Collaboratory, which is part of the Institute for Quantitative and Computational Biology, as an example. So what we're looking at here on the slide is a map of the offerings that this group does. Just to acknowledge, I don't run this group. This is a group run by Dr. Matteo Pellegrini at UCLA and managed by Eloy Lopez. But to kind of give a sense of what this group does is they offer a wide variety of workshops across the bioinformatics workflow to train the people at the institution how to do these kinds of research pipelines. Furthermore, this group provides a really holistic support and training for biosciences trainees. So not only do graduate students and like the UCL population have access to these lessons, the program creates a set of opportunities for people to get fellowships where they're granted funding in order to teach these workshops and create their own instructional materials. So we'll see where that goes in a second. And so because of this very large footprint, oh, and one thing that, in addition, that I'll add that's useful, at least for us at UCLA, is that a lot of the workshops listed here are actually course integrated. So graduate students can get credit for these workshops, undergraduates as well, staff and faculty can take these workshops at no cost to them. And so because of that, it's a really a useful service for people to get access to this content. But and it draws a very diverse pool of learners. But one of the things that we learned coming in from the library is that for training people outside of the biosciences, even the introductory workshops, the kind of workshops that serve as the kind of most inclusive points, aren't really, or at the time weren't really accessible to people who weren't in the biosciences. And so one of the kind of areas where I thought that the library could partner is trying to make these introductory workshops more inclusive. So kind of on that theme, despite the fact that the way that the workshops were taught wasn't as inclusive as it could have been, this group already maintained most of their instructional materials in a GitHub repository, and everything was openly available. So but it is complicated because for the user, because materials are inconsistently archived on a variety of places, websites, YouTube, GitHub pages. And so another area where the library can step in and provide some sort of support is in aggregating this content and helping the researchers and the fellows themselves publish this content so that they can cite it as part of their as a part of like the professional outputs that they're creating in their career. And in particular, using things like open data repositories and preprints gives people the opportunity to, so for those who are at a disadvantage in peer review settings, give an opportunity for them to showcase the professional output that they're creating without as many barriers. And so, yeah, kind of endpoint here, the one area that we've tried to help is in archiving and open educational resources. So, so far, we have looked at like the overarching picture of what providing data services looks like at UCLA. And we've taken a look at one particular example of one provider in this kind of constellation of providers on this campus. So let's take a look at how to, when delivering these workshops and kind of training people in data literacy, how can we use open data to create open educational resources? And since we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to go into like a lot of the details of I guess, how we do it, but I'll share a couple of examples of through the UCLA Collaboratory, we use open data to create instructional materials. So one example that I'm showing everyone here is a partnership that I had with the UCLA Data Sciences Center and also with the Collaboratory, where we took the instructional materials that I created and published them into our institutional data repository, where within here, a user can just go in and click on the materials, download everything that they need for the workshop, and everything is written out to within this file. As part of the lesson, I created it in a way so that it's kind of like plug and play. You can input a data set that you're working with as long as it's considered like tidy data. You can input any data set to work with, and this set of workshop materials should work with any data set. So I use, for my lessons, a public set of COVID data from the LA Times, but we also point to resources like Tidy Tuesday and other open data sets that people can use to kind of learn how to do some like basic data visualization and analysis using R. Another example is a workshop taught by Nicola and Carolina, shown here in the Collaboratory. This is part of the RNA sequencing pipeline, where their materials, their slides are all openly available on their website, and the videos are also posted on YouTube. So kind of all in all, these are just two examples of some workshops that are taught in part of the Collaboratory group. There's a link to the workshops on the slides, and people can kind of take a look at all the content that's generated. But one of kind of the gems for me in working in this space is that there's already, it's for this group, it's so kind of easy to like, since all of the workshop materials, a lot of this content already exists, it's just a matter of publishing it into a repository to give it some permanent identifier, so that so it's easier for the postdocs and those early career researchers who are trying to show their professional outputs to talk about the work that they're doing in a way that's open, it's transparent, and it's open to feedback. So one of the nice things about publishing content in the data repository like I did is that you can upload new versions of it as this workshop develops. And so that kind of allows us to be nimble and responsive to the groups that we're teaching. So I think I'm kind of running out of time here, but this is the last bit of the last section. That I want to cover. So we've talked about navigating networks of resources. We've taken a closer look at one particular partnership between the UCLA Library and the quantitative and computational biology partners. And we've discussed some examples of using open data to create open educational resources. Now let's talk about how we inform the way that we teach and the way that we create these resources at UCLA. Much of the instructional design, in the user engagement division in the UCLA Library, uses a learner-centered framework following some set of core competencies. So on the slide, I just kind of threw up a screenshot of a set of core competencies that I've worked with Ashley Peterson, one of our instructional design librarians, and the Data Sciences Center extensively for feedback. And essentially, we wanted to create this kind of internal document to guide our learning outcomes in instructional design. And we made this kind of open-ended and versatile. So if you're reading it, it definitely probably reads as very vague. But we wanted it to just kind of serve as the skeleton that we could build different data and digital literacy workshops around. And so our approach, and I dropped a link to the Open Science Framework site repository where we're keeping this set of core competencies. Basically, our goal is to create parallel to this set of core competencies, all of the instructional materials associated with these competencies, so that in one place, from kind of like a teacher standpoint, we can update the strategies that we use to teach, but also the materials that we teach them with. And since all of this is open, these things can be cited, it can be copied, iterated, modified, depending on the needs of like any external group that wants to work with this content. And so our kind of long-term goal of this project is to create an inclusive network of specialists that can provide both workshops but also online modules to the greater population. And one of our kind of primary focuses is to bridge this gap between the colloquial understanding of big data, so like the headlines that we see every day, and like kind of the lay understanding of what data means, and how do we make the connections between those things and like actually sitting down and programming in R or programming in Unix or Python to do these kind of technical things that are often kind of housed in the silos within an institution. And since and there's a lot more to this. We're working with the Writing Instruction and Research Education program called WIRE at UCLA to create asynchronous online modules that can be plugged into courses to help people learn different aspects of the research lifecycle. But now in this case, we're applying it to data skills and trying to make data training as kind of inclusive and accessible as possible. So to kind of wrap this up, we try really hard to build like an overarching context for the services that we provide and the work that we do, so that we can figure out how to best support our community. And so this takes a lot of like talking with people in a variety of different places, and a lot of kind of like brainstorming. And admittedly, for everything that I've talked about, there's a lot of kind of upkeep to make sure that we're responsive and inclusive for the populations that we serve. So at the core of it, consistent engagement with our stakeholders really allows us to improve upon the work that we're doing. Okay, so with that, I know that's been a lot, but I want to say that I'm happy to answer any questions and talk more about any of the projects discussed during this talk. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that none of the stuff that I talked about would have been possible without an immense amount of work and support throughout the campus, especially the user engagement team, which is the division that I work in at the UCLA Library, also the UCLA Data Sciences Center, which has provided a lot of infrastructure from the library side of things to get our data literacy training up and running. Also the Institute for Quantitative and Computational Biology, who've included me as a fellow, and a variety of other campus partners relevant to this talk. So with that, thank you all again. And I'm open for questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, anything that y'all have in mind.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really informative. We've gotten one question in the chat so far, so I'll read that to you. It says, thanks for sharing all this. Do you have a reuse license associated with the data literacy materials on OSF?
That's a great question. I think currently our plans to make it an open license. I'll have to double check on that, but it should be like a CC0 or a CC BY license on those resources.
Awesome. Well, that's the only question in the chat. So we'll give folks a minute to type their questions in if they have them, but in the meantime, I have one for you.
Okay.
So I was really interested in hearing about these. Actually, one just came in, so I'm going to go prioritize the chat question.
Okay.
Does your team or the library have any formal marketing channels for these workshops, or is it all word of mouth, as you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. So there are a lot of different avenues that people hear about these resources, the workshops. We have one centralized website where people can literally workshops.ucla.edu. It's something that's really easy for us to just tell people. And it's one place where people can find all workshops, not just of the ones that I talked about, but like across all of the data services providers that I showed in that little constellation. In addition, we also have like social media channels that the UCLA Library has. A lot of the different kind of dots on that constellation that I talked about, they also have their own social media channels. So there's a lot, and plus students are told about these workshops in the classes that they're taking. So there's a lot of both word of mouth, social media, email approaches throughout within and externally to bring people into the workshop. So we definitely have the population to teach. It's complicated to make sure that we make it if people hear about it, they need to be able to learn something from it. It can't just be that we have the resources. So anyway, I hope that answers the question.
Awesome, thanks. I'll ask my question now. So I'm interested to hear more about this mapping that you did to understand, who's providing what types of services and to whom. Do you think this is something that folks at other institutions are doing as well, or not so much? And sort of like, what did you learn about this process doing it, and what tips would you give to people who are thinking about doing something like this at their institution?
That's a really great question. I mean, I imagine a lot of people who are just trying to better understand what resources that they have are doing something like this. I kind of, I don't know exactly if they're drawing it out in the way that I did. I think that mine is like maybe not the most scientific way of mapping it, but I guess in terms of like strategies and advice on how to do that, for honestly, for me, it just took like patience. For me, I always tell myself patience is the key to joy. And I really needed to embody that as I was navigating these resources, because basically what I did was I talked to, like, the big dots on that constellation. I talked to people within those big dots to see which other groups provide services in different places. And it's just a lot of like talking to people, multiple people within each group, figuring out like what offerings do they have? Do you have a website? How do you advertise your services? Are you open to everyone on campus or only open to your department? That's one question that we've run into a lot. Because again, departments have limited resources, right? So for some departments, you can work with one person on data literacy work, or like a digital humanities project, and like that's it. And so yeah, it's a lot of like talking with people and figuring out like, how do you showcase yourself? And then once you have this kind of map of like how each group showcases and represents their work, you can kind of bring all that stuff together and then draw common themes between those different approaches, like common themes as in workshops, common themes as in consultations, like what small group projects do you do, what community building do you do, and those kinds of questions are things to think about as you're kind of like mapping out resources within your own institution, or really broadly, right, beyond institutions, just what resources exist in that open landscape.
Awesome. Looks like we have time for a couple more quick questions, hopefully. For the user engagement team you're in, compared with other topics the team works on, what's the unique approach you'd say for data literacy in particular, except for using open data as an example?
I would say that I try really hard. So I don't necessarily come from a librarianship background. My background is in research before it was, and I've only been a librarian for like 2 years. So I really find the user engagement kind of model to be really inspiring. Their learner-centered design focus, they're kind of paying a lot of attention to like what resources do we collect, and like how do we talk about the collections that we have to make sure that our users are, one, aware of them, know how to navigate them, and so on. So I think the unique part of it is me being able to create partnerships with researchers to show them that the approach that the library takes to disseminating and talking about resources can actually help researchers in a lot of ways. So it's not necessarily like, it's really bringing in kind of the librarianship mentality into that research space that's I think been effective for us, and unique. But like I don't know, maybe this is like my naivete in like librarianship, but I feel like the things that are brought to me by the user engagement division, like learner-centered design and those types of practices, I feel like that's something that's talked a lot about in libraries. So I feel like I'm catching up to the approaches that many people on this call maybe already know about.
Awesome. Do you have time for one more question? I think there's a good one in the chat. Okay,
Sure,
awesome.
yeah, let's go for it.
Did you run into any organizational hierarchy issues asking these questions and getting the word out about your offerings? And what strategies have you used to navigate those, if so?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for posing it. So yes, constantly. Bureaucratic hurdles are like the backbone of the institution, it feels like sometimes. No, so for the mapping project in particular, with that kind of train map that I talked about, one of the challenges to implementing it is that we had some people who said, I don't want my services on there because it's not open to everyone on campus. Other people who were like, yeah, like just put everything on there. And then the resources that they do offer aren't inclusive to everyone. So even though they're offering it, it's not inclusive. So just kind of wrangling through like all of the talking heads on the project was complicated in and of itself, let alone the implementation of like, do we want these offerings to go to students, or do you want them to go to faculty? So I would say I sat in on like dozens of committee meetings just deciding how to implement it. And because of bureaucratic fatigue, I would say that we haven't made as much progress on that project as we would have liked. But again, as I'd mentioned, like mapping of the services that we have is like absolutely critical to simplifying the process of delivering these services to our communities. And so despite the headaches and me telling myself to be patient, a lot of this work feels necessary in order to make, again, these services as open and inclusive as possible.
Awesome. Well, we are more than out of time for today. Thank you for staying a couple minutes over to answer that last question. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And obviously a huge thank you to Ibrahim for coming and being our kickoff speaker this week and helping us put this event together. If you do have more questions for Ibrahim, he'll be back on Friday for our panel chat, so you can bring them there. And we hope to see all of you at the rest of our coffee chats this week and our panel on Friday. I will post the links to those classes in the chat once more, so you can register for those. Remember, you'll get the recording of today, and I think that's all we've got. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will go ahead and end the recording. Thanks.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.